Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, listeners. It's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, a conversation with Michelle Colder Carras, a digital mental health researcher, about how an online gaming community became a way for veterans to help one another through mental health crises and to prevent suicides. Let's listen. Michelle Colder Carras, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call. Your research deals with gaming and mental health. Could you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, of course. So interesting story behind it, actually. When I was a PhD student in the Department of Mental Health in 2011, I learned about the work that was being done on the social aspects and potential benefits of gaming that was just kind of starting up in other fields outside of public health. And I decided to study that for my thesis. But at the time, in public health, games and video gaming were considered a negative exposure, like playing violent video games or becoming addicted. So I was told that I could study video game addiction. I managed to find some research in the public health field that was looking at social interactions in games and their relationship to game addiction. So I began with that, and I used a person-centered statistical approach to try to separate out some factors that might contribute to benefits of games and problems people develop.
And so tell us a little bit about what you learned. What do we know about these online gaming communities and some of the support they can offer?
It's really interesting. There are obviously communities that crop up around video games, and they're facilitated by the new ways of interacting online that have come about over the last several years. And some of these things have been in existence for a long time, but kind of in the little niche gaming communities. So not things that we would consider general knowledge, but since the pandemic, now many more people understand what Discord is. We use virtual meetings all the time, so we understand the way that they could be beneficial, but they're different from face-to-face communication. Now my work is more broadly in digital well-being in general. Like, what can these new types of media, new ways of interacting, how can they help us and how can they benefit, as opposed to just being considered problems and potentially addictive? So really, digital balance is the idea. And that comes from my collaborator in the Netherlands, Tony van Rooij, with this concept that we have different domains of our life. To say it another way, how do we look at the potential benefits of screen time or using digital media and understand what those are so that we can balance them with the potential drawbacks?
You used the word community earlier, and I suspect that's very intentional.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's one thing that's become a paradigm shift. When I started looking at this, the idea of online communities as being a potential benefit was really not something we thought of in public health. But again, this is an area where things have changed since the pandemic. And now we understand that communities are driving mental health interventions for themselves. Communities are identifying the need to have these interventions, and public health and clinical researchers are starting to learn to take advantage of that. So teasing out what is useful and what drives the utility of features of interventions is something we do in implementation research. And I've been trying to get into that and figure out how can we evaluate grassroots efforts and understand what can transfer or generalize to other settings.
Let's dig into one of those specific examples. So you recently had an article that was published in one of the journals of the American Psychiatric Association talking about the Stack Up Overwatch program, or STOP. So tell us about STOP.
Sure, happy to. First, I have to give you the very interesting background on Stack Up and how it was started. Stack Up is a veteran-serving organization that is focused on the gaming community. And it was started by a veteran who came back from combat setting, and he had pretty severe PTSD, and he did not want to leave his home. So he ended up immersing himself in World of Warcraft, which is actually one of my favorite video games. He did that almost exclusively for a month until he felt his mental state settle down and he felt like he would not be too triggered from being outside. From that point, he decided that video games could be a useful way to help veterans. So he developed StackUp, and StackUp has a few different programs designed to help video games. One of them is centered on the online community, which is hosted through a Discord server. And anyone can join this community. You can have the opportunity to chat online, text chat in real time, voice chat in real time. Events are organized within the community. And since Discord has added different features, now we can have meetings, we could play games together. So it's a very intentionally developed community that's a combination of the grassroots efforts of a person who wanted to help veteran mental health and the affordances of both an online communication platform, Discord, and video games themselves. So the STOP program also had a really interesting grassroots evolution. When the Discord server started, it was pretty quickly discovered that many of the members had mental health problems or even crises that they needed help with. And the approach that the community took, they understood that there are resources out there to help veterans in crisis, but sometimes those resources are not very accessible. And as we know, veteran suicide is a huge problem. So the community decided to help itself. And they had a couple of first responders who were members of the community who led the charge to develop a specific intervention to mitigate crisis and prevent suicide. So they found some resources. They used training videos through a program called PsychArmor, which was designed to help people help veterans with their mental health. And they developed this separate channel, the StackUp Overwatch program, that focused on providing peer support, meaning support that's overseen by a professional, but delivered by citizens who have training. That's how they took care of their community. And when I learned about this, I was so excited because this was really the kind of thing that I had been looking to learn more about and study.
What was it like to study a community in this context?
It took me a while, but I was a part of the community for a couple of years. I attended meetings. I hung out in the channels. I used my knowledge and identity as a gamer to connect to community members and to the leaders. But at the same time, I stayed humble and authentic to the fact that I am not a veteran. I am a researcher. I am interested in using your community to do research on this fantastic program. So it was such a wonderful experience.
So you joined this community as a researcher, identify yourself as a researcher, and you're not lurking in the shadows. You're very clear and open and transparent about what you're doing. And then what did you learn?
So what we learned was that the community members helped develop this research from the very beginning. So we secured Veteran Suicide Prevention Grant from the CDC Foundation. And I worked really closely with several community members to develop a logic model that described the different programs that were offered by StackUp. And we finished creating the logic model and developed some questions that we could use for a more formal evaluation project. So we ended up getting another Veteran Suicide Prevention Grant. And we were able to look at, did STOP meet the needs of the community as identified by the community? We worked together with the community to develop some ethical guidelines for how to conduct the research and to figure out which data sources we could use to answer the questions. So we ended up having this pretty complicated mixed methods design. But through that design, we were able to figure out that STOP was truly able to respond very quickly to members posting needs or questions in the STOP channel. Many members were looking for mental health support. Many, but not all members were veterans. So it was not being solely delivered to veterans. But people were generally pretty satisfied with a sense of community and the way in which their participation in STOP actually did help reduce their feelings of anxiety and increase their feelings of coping. We were able to identify that participating in STOP helped reduce the symptoms that brought people to seek crisis intervention help. And we, most importantly, I think, were in a very interesting finding. We learned that the people who were delivering the intervention, the peer supporters, almost all of them identified as having the lived experience of some type of mental health problem, not necessarily PTSD, which is what we always associate with veteran mental health, but also depression and anxiety. That gives us something very valuable that provides more support for the idea that providing peer support is something that can help people.
So the idea of training peer health workers, for lack of a better term, is not new to public health. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast. And so, they're trained peer supporters in these groups. And when you say they're delivering the intervention, are they de-escalating crisis in the moment? Are they linking people with resources? What does this look like?
The trickier answer to that is, and this is something that many public health researchers and clinicians are really interested in, how does this type of intervention compare to something that is more widely scaled or developed specifically through public health or clinical intervention development? It's a non-traditional process. It was a grassroots process. The Stack Up as an organization, at the time that we studied them, they had no interest in becoming an official VA crisis prevention program. So they were not aiming to meet specific standards. That said, they identified a set of training materials and a process that took about 40 hours. So they went through similar types of training that community health workers or frontline health workers might go through. They had the advantage of this technology platform that had a lot of offerings that they could take advantage of. There was no need to develop a digital health intervention, for example. They were just able to leverage the existing online community and the existing technology within the community. So one thing that crisis chat lines, which are, I guess, the closest purposefully developed public health intervention, one thing that they do is to have things going on in the background, back channeling. So a worker may be in the middle of a crisis chat with a user, and they are able to get supervision in the background through another chat. So they can have both open at the same time. STOP had a similar way of working, but they also had a team channel. So while someone was on a voice chat or a text chat with a STOP user, they could be typing things into the team chat. Hey, has anyone ever dealt with, for example, not being able to access resources for financial difficulty in this city? And the team would be like, oh yeah, you need to go to, let's use the example of, they're in the panhandle of West Virginia. Oh, they need to go to Martinsburg. If they go up to Frederick, that's not going to be as helpful. So there was really deep knowledge of resources that are available, combined with that back channeling, it made it very useful. The users really perceived the value of those resources very highly.
It sounds like it was really artfully designed.
That's a good way to think of it. It was artfully designed. And the thing that's so encouraging to me is that it's a great example of a grassroots program that has the right amount of clinical involvement from someone who is also a member of the community. It's a fantastic example of a person who's not clinical saying, this is a need, and then having different levels of clinician involvement to get to that point where you've developed something that is really useful. That said, there's an outcome in suicide prevention, especially online suicide prevention, that is really a challenge for any crisis intervention program. And that is understanding what the outcome is of the program for actually preventing suicide. In that sense, STOP faced the same challenge. We can really never measure whether a suicide has occurred when we have an anonymous intervention. one of the things that are focused on in this setting is process measures. If we know that it's important to have a welfare check, have emergency services come out, that's a process measure that's often used. And STOP was able to identify that was a useful intervention for them in many cases.
Well, Michelle Colder Carras, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for all of the work that you're doing, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.